Personality is a complex construct that has been defined in a variety of ways. What does it mean to say that someone has an optimistic personality? Well, this assertion indicates that the person has a fairly consistent tendency to behave in a cheerful, hopeful, and enthusiastic way, looking at the bright side of things across a wide variety of situations. Although no one is entirely consistent in behavior, this quality of consistency across situations lies at the core of the concept of personality. According to our text, personality is a person's internally based characteristic ways of acting and thinking. In the early 19th century, Franz Gall developed phrenology, a theory of personality which assumed that a person's personality could be determined by measuring the bumps on his skull. Areas that he believed were associated with particular personality traits are indicated in this phrenology chart. Although Gall's idea that brain functions, such as language, tend to be localized is true, the size of the bumps on a person's head has nothing to do with their personality. In this lecture, we'll begin with the psychoanalytic approach to personality. Freud believed that most personality, which in his theory includes components that he called the id, ego, and superego, is unconscious. The ego uses various defense mechanisms, Freud said, to reduce anxiety. Then we'll move on to the humanistic approach and the social cognitive approach to personality. Humanistic perspectives stress a person's capacity for personal growth and positive human qualities. Social cognitive theory states that behavior, environment, and person cognitive factors are important in understanding personality. And we'll end up with trait theories of personality and then personality assessment. Trait theories emphasize that personality consists of traits, broad, enduring dispositions that lead to characteristic responses. Sigmund Freud, one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century, was born in Freiburg, Moravia in 1856 and died in London at the age of 83. Freud spent most of his life in Vienna, but he left the city near the end of his career to escape the Holocaust. He received a medical degree and was a clinical neurologist treating patients with emotional disorders. He believed sex was a primary cause of emotional problems and was a critical component of his personality theory. Freud thought that the human sexual drive was the main determinant of personality development, and he felt that psychological disorders, dreams, and all human behavior represent the conflict between this unconscious sexual drive and the demands of civilized society. Now, Freud developed psychoanalysis, his approach to personality, through his work with patients suffering from hysteria, and he remains an important influence in Western culture. Perhaps Freud's most enduring insight was his recognition of how unconscious forces can influence behavior. He inferred the existence of the unconscious from a variety of observations that he made with his patients. For example, he noticed that slips of the tongue often revealed a person's true feelings, hence the expression Freudian slip. Through psychoanalysis, he often helped patients discover feelings and conflicts they had previously been unaware of. Now, Freud contrasted the unconscious with the conscious and preconscious, creating three levels of awareness. The conscious mind is Freud's term for what we are presently aware. For example, at this moment, your conscious mind may include the train of thought in this lecture, and a dim awareness in the back of your mind that your eyes are getting tired or that you're beginning to get hungry. The preconscious mind is Freud's term for what is stored in memory that one is not presently aware of but can access. Examples might include your middle name, what you had for supper last night, or an argument you had with a friend yesterday. The unconscious mind is Freud's term for the part of our mind which we cannot become aware, but that nonetheless exerts a great influence on behavior. Examples of material that might be found in your unconscious include a forgotten trauma from childhood, hidden feelings of hostility toward a parent, and repressed sexual desires. So Freud theorized we have three levels of awareness: the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. The enormous size of the unconscious is often dramatized by comparing it to the portion of an iceberg that lies beneath the water's surface. Freud also divided personality structure into three components: the id, ego, and superego, that operate according to different principles and exhibit different modes of thinking. In Freud's model, the id is entirely unconscious, but the ego and superego operate at all three levels of awareness. In the iceberg model of the mind, the small part above the water is our conscious mind. The part just below the surface is the preconscious, and the major portion hidden underwater is the unconscious. A person has access only to the conscious and preconscious levels of awareness. The conscious is what the person is presently thinking about. The preconscious is information that the person could bring into conscious awareness. Freud hypothesized that the human psyche consists of three agencies or components: the id, ego, and superego. For Freud, the interplay among these agencies gives rise to our personalities, and differences in the strength of these three agencies account largely for individual differences in personality. The id is the reservoir of our most primitive impulses, a seething cauldron of desires that provide the driving force for much of our behavior. It's the original personality, the only part present at birth, and the part out of which the other two parts of personality emerge. It resides in the unconscious mind. It's the part of the iceberg submerged underwater. It contains a variety of drives, particularly the sexual drive or libido, and the aggressive drive. Although critics have sometimes accused Freud of saying that everything is sex, this allegation is only partly true. Freud believed the libido to be of crucial importance in personality, but he maintained that other impulses, particularly aggression, also play a significant shaping role. The id includes biological instinctual drives, the primitive parts of our personality located in our unconscious, such as the life instincts for survival, reproduction, and pleasure, and the death instincts, destructive and aggressive drives detrimental to our survival. And it operates on the pleasure principle. That is, it demands immediate gratification for these drives without the concern for the consequences of this gratification. The word no isn't in the id's vocabulary. The ego is the boss of our personality, its principal decision maker. The ego's primary tasks are interacting with the real world and finding ways to resolve the competing demands of the id and the superego. It starts developing during the first year or so of life to find realistic and socially acceptable outlets for the id's needs. It operates on the reality principle. That is, finding gratification for instinctual drives within the constraints of reality, the norms and laws of society. And it serves as the executive manager of the personality. The superego represents one's conscience and idealized standards of behavior in their culture. The term literally means above ego, and Freud conceptualized this component much like a judgmental parent looking down upon the ego. The superego contains the sense of right and wrong we've internalized from our interactions with society, particularly our parents. It operates on the morality principle, threatening to overwhelm us with guilt and shame. The demands of the superego and id will come into conflict, and the ego will have to resolve this turmoil within the constraints of reality. Now, to prevent being overcome with anxiety because of trying to satisfy the id and superego demands, the ego uses what Freud called defense mechanisms, processes that distort reality and protect us from anxiety. Now, according to Freudians, people with overly developed superegos are guilt-prone, whereas particularly guilt-free people are at risk for developing psychopathic personalities. No aspect of Freud's theory is more controversial than his model of psychosexual development, nor has any aspect of his theory been more widely criticized. According to Freud, personality development proceeds through a series of stages. He termed these stages psychosexual because each focuses on an erogenous zone. An erogenous zone is the area of the body where the id's pleasure-seeking psychic energy is focused during a particular stage. A change in erogenous zones designates the beginning of a new stage. He maintained that the extent to which we resolve each stage successfully bears crucial implications for later personality development. He believed that people can become fixated or stuck in an early stage of development. Fixation occurs when a portion of the id's pleasure-seeking energy remains in a stage because of excessive gratification or frustration of our instinctual needs. And it continues throughout a person's life and impacts behavior and personality traits. Let's examine the psychosexual stages as Freud conceptualized them, bearing in mind that many modern critics don't share his views. The first stage of psychosexual development, the oral stage, focuses on the mouth. During this stage, infants obtain pleasure primarily by sucking and drinking. Freud believed that adults who are orally fixated tend to react to stress by becoming intensely dependent on others for reassurance, a form of regression. Just as infants depend on their mother's breast as a source of satisfaction, they're also prone to unhealthy oral behaviors like overeating, drinking excessively, or smoking. At the anal stage, children first come face to face with psychological conflict. During this stage, children want to alleviate tension and experience pleasure by moving their bowels. But soon they discover that they can't do so whenever nature calls. If children's toilet training is either too harsh or too lenient, they'll become fixated and prone to regressing to this stage during anxiety-provoking circumstances. Freudians believe that anally fixated individuals, anal personalities, tend toward excessive neatness, stinginess, and stubbornness in adulthood. The phallic stage is of utmost importance to Freudians in explaining personality. Children develop a powerful attraction for the opposite sex parent, as well as a desire to eliminate the same sex parent as a rival. And here's where things get complicated, so fasten your seatbelts. The Oedipus complex, or conflict, is where the little boy becomes sexually attracted to his mother and fears the father, his rival, will find out and castrate him. Now, ultimately, these castration anxieties and the impossibility of ever obtaining the mother as a love object lead the boy to abandon his love. He then identifies with the aggressor, in this case his father, and adopts his characteristics. Nonetheless, if children don't resolve this complex, the stage is set for psychological problems later in life. In contrast, girls develop the Electra complex or conflict. The little girl is attracted to her father because he has a penis, she wants one, and feels inferior without one. This is called penis envy. Now, for reasons that Freud never clearly explained, girls believe themselves inferior to boys because of their missing organ. Now, according to Freud, this sense of inferiority persists beyond childhood for years and even decades. Penis envy is probably Freud's most ridiculed concept, and with good reason, largely because there's no research support for it. The fourth psychosexual stage, the latency stage, is a period of calm following the stormy phallic stage. In latency, which lasts from about 6 to 12 years, sexual impulses are submerged into the unconscious. No erogenous zone exists, sexual feelings are repressed, and the focus is on cognitive and social development. Most boys and girls during this stage find members of the opposite sex to be yucky and utterly unappealing. During the fifth and final psychosexual stage, the genital stage, which generally begins around age 12, sexual impulses reawaken. The erogenous zone is at the genitals, and the child develops sexual relationships, moving toward intimate adult relationships. If development up to this point has proceeded without major glitches, this stage witnesses the emergence of mature romantic relationships. In contrast, if serious problems weren't resolved at earlier stages, difficulties with establishing intimate love attachments are likely. Freud described healthy and unhealthy personalities. Unhealthy personalities develop when one is too dependent on defense mechanisms and when the id or superego is unusually strong or the ego unusually weak. Healthy personalities develop when none of the three personality structures dominate and all systems act in a harmonious way. As I've already mentioned, there's been widespread criticism of Freud's psychoanalytic theory of personality. Freud's notion of an unconscious level of awareness is impossible to examine scientifically. And even though the first years of life are important, they're not as powerful in shaping adult personality as Freud thought. Later experiences deserve more attention. There's little evidence for the impact on development of the psychosexual stages. Contemporary researchers think repression seldom, if ever, occurs. We understand today how Freud's questioning techniques during therapy may have created such so-called repressed memories in his patients. And there's evidence that people fight hard to maintain self-esteem, but not necessarily through defense mechanisms, as Freud described them. Sociocultural factors are much more important than Freud believed. In stressing the id's dominance, Freud placed more emphasis on the biological basis of personality. Largely in reaction to criticisms of Freudian theory, a number of theorists, many of them Freud's own students, broke from their mentor to forge their own models of personality. Because these thinkers modified Freud's views in significant ways, they're typically referred to as Neo-Freudians. Neo-Freudians agree with many of Freud's basic ideas, but differ in one or more important ways, such as Carl Jung's collective unconsciousness, Alfred Adler's striving for superiority, and Horney and the need for security. Carl Jung shared Freud's interest in the unconscious, but he believed that Freud underplayed the unconscious mind's role in personality. In fact, Jung believed that the roots of personality go back to the dawn of human existence. The collective unconscious is Jung's name for the impersonal deepest layer of the unconscious mind, shared by all human beings because of their common ancestral past. Jung posited that the collective unconscious contains archetypes, emotionally laden ideas and images that have rich and symbolic meaning for all people. Jung concluded that these archetypes emerge in art, literature, religion, and dreams, and he used archetypes to help people understand themselves. Notions of the collective unconscious and archetypes are more mystical than scientific and cannot be empirically tested. Alfred Adler was one of Freud's earliest followers, but his approach to personality was drastically different. Adler believed people are motivated by purposes and goals, and Adler argued that people have the ability to take their genetic inheritance and their environmental experiences and act upon them creatively to become the person they want to be. Adler thought that everyone strives for superiority by seeking to adapt, improve, and master the environment. Striving for superiority is our response to the uncomfortable feelings of inferiority that we experience as infants and young children when we interact with bigger, more powerful people. Striving for superiority, then, is the main motivation to overcome the sense of inferiority that is felt as infants given their totally helpless independent state. A healthy person learns to cope with these feelings, becomes confident, and develops a sense of self-esteem. Otherwise, an inferiority complex can develop, which involves strong feelings of inferiority felt by those who never overcome this initial feeling of inferiority. Horney rejected the classical psychoanalytic concept that anatomy is destiny, and cautioned that some of Freud's most popular ideas were only hypotheses. She also argued that sociocultural influences on personality development should be considered. Horney believed that the need for security, not for sex, is the prime motive in human existence. The need for security focuses on dealing with our need for security rather than a sense of inferiority. Horney reasoned that an individual whose needs for security are met should be able to develop his or her capacities to the fullest extent. And a child's caregivers must provide a sense of security for a healthy personality to develop. Without security, a feeling of helplessness and insecurity in a hostile world will result. She viewed psychological health as allowing a person to express his or her talents and abilities freely and spontaneously. She also identified 3 neurotic personality patterns: moving toward people, moving against people, and moving away from people. The next section of this lecture covers the humanistic approach and the social cognitive approach to personality. Humanistic theories developed in the 1960s as a part of a response to the deterministic, psychoanalytic, and strict behavioral psychological approaches that dominated psychology and the study of personality. These theories emphasize conscious free will in one's actions and the uniqueness of the individual person and personal growth. We'll look at the theories of Maslow and Rogers. The social cognitive theories were developed in the 1960s as well as a rebellion against the narrowness of the strict behavioral approach to the development of personality. And these theories emphasize both social and cognitive factors along with conditioning to explain personality development. And we'll look at Bandura's theory as well as Rogers' ideas. Abraham Maslow was a prominent humanistic theorist who argued that psychology should take a greater interest in the nature of the healthy personality instead of dwelling on the causes of disorders. He's considered the father of the humanistic movement and studied the lives of healthy and creative people to develop his theory of personality. Maslow's key contributions were his analysis of how motives are organized hierarchically and his description of the healthy personality. His hierarchy of needs was an arrangement of the innate needs that motivate our behavior. Maslow proposed that human motives are organized into a hierarchy of needs, a systematic arrangement of needs according to priority, in which basic needs must be met before less basic needs are aroused. This hierarchical arrangement is usually portrayed as a pyramid. The needs toward the bottom of the pyramid, such as physiological or security needs, are the most basic. Higher levels on the pyramid consist of progressively less basic needs and more psychological needs. When a person manages to satisfy a level of needs reasonably well, complete satisfaction is not necessary. This satisfaction activates needs at the next level. The hierarchy includes the first 4 needs that are deficiency-based and a 5th need that is growth-based. Because of his interest in self-actualization, Maslow conducted research to analyze the nature of the healthy personality. He called people with exceptionally healthy personalities self-actualizing persons because of their commitment to continued personal growth. Maslow identified various traits characteristic of self-actualizing people. Some of these characteristics include accepting themselves, others, and the nature of the world for what they are, having a need for privacy and only a few close emotional relationships, being autonomous and independent, democratic, and very creative, and having peak experiences, which are experiences of deep insight in which they experience whatever they're doing as fully as possible. The other key figure in the development of humanistic psychology, Carl Rogers, began his career as a psychotherapist, struggling to understand the unhappiness of the individuals he encountered in therapy. Rogers' groundbreaking work established the foundation for more contemporary studies of personal growth and self-determination. Rogers was a client-centered therapist who dealt with young, bright college students with adjustment problems, and he emphasized self-actualization. But interestingly, he believed that we are all born with the raw ingredients of a fulfilling life. We simply need the right conditions to thrive. Just as a sunflower seed, once planted in rich soil and given water and sunshine, will grow into a strong, healthy flower, all humans will flourish in the appropriate environment. And he believed that people have a strong need for positive regard, that is, to be accepted by and have the affection of others, especially the significant others in our life. In terms of personality development, Rogers was concerned with how childhood experiences promote a congruent or incongruent self-concept. According to Rogers, people have a strong need for affection and acceptance from others. Early in life, parents provide most of this affection. Rogers maintained that some parents make their affection conditional. That is, it depends on the child's behaving well and living up to expectations. This sets up conditions of worth, which develop as parents set up behaviors and attitudes for which they would give us positive regard. And these conditions of worth contribute to a person's development of a self-concept. And meeting conditions of worth continues then throughout life. When parental love seems conditional, children often block out of their self-concept those experiences that make them feel unworthy of love. They do so because they're worried about parental acceptance, which appears precarious. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, some parents make their affection unconditional. Their children have less need to block out unworthy experiences because they've been assured that they're worthy of affection no matter what they do. It is this unconditional positive regard that is acceptance and approval without conditions that allows personal growth. Empathy from others and having others be genuine with respect to personal feelings is necessary if we are to be self-actualized. Rogers believed that unconditional love from parents fosters congruence and that conditional love fosters incongruence. He further theorized that if individuals grow up believing that their affection from others is highly conditional, they will go on to distort more and more of their experiences in order to feel worthy of acceptance from a wider and wider array of people. In Rogers' self-theory, the important construct is the self-concept. However, Rogers acknowledges that one's self-concept may not be consistent with the realities of one's actual experience or true self, a condition called incongruence on the right. Now, on the left, you see congruence. Self-concept meshes well with the actual experience. Now, some incongruence is probably unavoidable. Now, on the right, you see incongruence. Self-concept does not mesh well with one's actual experience. Albert Bandura is one of several behaviorists who have added a cognitive flavor to behaviorism since the 1960s. They point out that humans obviously are conscious, thinking, and feeling beings. Bandura agrees with the fundamental thrust of behaviorism in that he believes that personality is largely shaped through learning. However, he contends that conditioning is not a mechanical process in which people are passive participants. Instead, he maintains that people actively seek out and process information about their environment to maximize favorable outcomes. One of his biggest constructs is called the self system, which is a set of cognitive processes by which a person observes, evaluates, and regulates his or her social behavior. And the self system includes a conscious decision to choose what behavior to engage in based on an assessment of reinforcement value. Now, Bandura discusses how a variety of personal factors, aspects of personality, govern behavior. The factor he emphasized most is self-efficacy. Self-efficacy refers to a judgment of one's effectiveness in dealing with particular situations and plays a major role in determining our behavior. When self-efficacy is high, individuals feel confident that they can execute the responses necessary to earn reinforcement. When self-efficacy is low, individuals worry that the necessary responses may be beyond their abilities. Perceptions of self-efficacy are subjective and specific to certain kinds of tasks. For instance, you might feel extremely confident about your ability to handle difficult social situations. On the other hand, you might be doubtful about your ability to handle academic challenges. Perceptions of self-efficacy can influence which challenges people pursue and how well they perform. For example, research has linked self-efficacy to job performance and success in adhering to an exercise regimen. Bandura's self-efficacy concept is similar to locus of control, a concept proposed by another social cognitive theorist, Julian Rotter. It considers the tendency of people to believe that control resides internally within them, or externally with others or the situation. Like other preferences, this is a spectrum. Some people have a wholly internal or external locus of control, but many will have some balance between both views, perhaps varying with the situation. For example, some may be more internal at home and more external at work. So locus of control is a person's perception of the extent to which he or she controls what happens to him or her. Now, an external locus of control refers to the perception that chance or external forces beyond your control determine your fate. People with external locus of control may develop learned helplessness or hopelessness, and they may think they are unable to prevent unpleasant events. An internal locus of control refers to the perception that you can control your fate. People with an internal locus of control perceive success as dependent on their own needs and their own performance. Now, locus of control can have a major impact on your life, from how you cope with stress to your motivation to take charge of your life. In the final section of the lecture, we'll talk about trait theories of personality and personality assessment. Personality traits, first of all, are internally based, relatively stable characteristics that define an individual's personality, and they contain a dimension, a continuum ranging from one extreme of the dimension to the other. According to trait theories, personality consists of broad, enduring dispositions or traits that tend to lead to characteristic responses. In other words, we can describe people in terms of the ways they behave, such as whether they're outgoing, friendly, private, or hostile. People who have a strong tendency to behave in certain ways are referred to as high on the traits. Those with a weak tendency to behave in these ways are low on the traits. Now, although trait theorists differ about which traits make up personality, they agree that traits are the fundamental building blocks of personality. Trait theories use factor analysis and other statistical techniques to tell them how many basic personality factors or traits are needed to describe human personality and the factors themselves. And they also identify clusters of test items, for example, on a personality test, that measure the same trait or factor. As you'll see in your reading, the trait theorists varied in the number and kind of personality traits they proposed. For example, Raymond B. Cattell used factor analysis and found that 16 traits were necessary to describe human personality. On the other hand, Hans Eysenck used factor analysis and argued for 3 trait dimensions. And according to Eysenck, personality is largely shaped by one's genes. Eysenck showed a special interest in explaining variations in the extroversion-introversion dimension. He proposed that introverts are more easily aroused by events biologically, which makes them more bashful, tentative, and uneasy in social situations, leading them to turn inward. Cattell and Eysenck differed because statistically, the number of traits depends on the level of categorization in the factor analysis. It seems Eysenck went a level higher and found fewer traits. Eysenck's theory is at a more general and inclusive level of abstraction than Cattell's. Although there's no complete consensus among trait theorists regarding the most scientifically supported model of personality structure, one model has amassed an impressive body of research evidence. This model, called the Big Five, consists of 5 traits that have surfaced repeatedly in factor analyses of personality measures. The Big Five were uncovered using a lexical approach to personality, which proposes that the most crucial features of human personality are embedded in our language. The logic here is that if a personality trait is important in our daily lives, it's likely that we talk a lot about it. The Big Five emerged from factor analyses of trait terms in dictionaries and works of literature. Now, the five factors are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And you can remember it by using the mnemonic ocean. It appears to be universal, and it has been observed across gender and diverse languages and cultures, and it's measured using several assessment instruments, the Neo-PIR, the Neo-PI3, and the Neo-FFI. Here's a chart from the text that I've reproduced, which describes each dimension on the low end and the high end. And according to McCrae and Costa, the five dimensions are openness to experience, sometimes just called openness. Open people tend to be intellectually curious and receptive to new ideas. Conscientious people tend to be well organized, dependable, careful, and disciplined. Extroverted people are sociable, talkative, friendly, and adventurous. And agreeable people are sympathetic, polite, good-natured, soft-hearted. And neurotic individuals are emotional, insecure, nervous, and self-pitying. Now, according to Big Five advocates, we can use these factors to describe all people, including those with psychological disorders. Each of us occupies some location on all five of these dimensions. A severely depressed person, for example, may be low in extroversion, high in neuroticism, and about average on the other three dimensions. Trait theory has been highly influential in personality psychology, but a bombshell book came out in 1968, Personality and Assessment by Walter Mischel, and it called the very notion of personality traits into question. We'll call this the person-situation controversy. Walter Mischel argued that situations and not personality traits determine a person's behavior, and he pointed out the situation dependence of behavior. Psychologists had long assumed that traits influence behavior across many situations, but in his review of the literature, Mischel found low correlations among different behaviors presumed to reflect the same trait. Now, Mischel concluded that measures of personality aren't especially helpful for what they're designed to do, forecast behavior. One of the greatest contributions of personality psychology to the science of psychology is its development of rigorous methods for measuring mental processes. Psychologists use a number of scientifically developed methods to evaluate personality. They assess personality for different reasons. The primary uses of personality tests are to aid in diagnosing people with problems, to aid in counseling, and in making personnel decisions. The two major types of personality assessments are personality inventories and projective tests. Personality inventories are designed to measure multiple traits of personality and in some cases to diagnose disorders. They include a series of questions or statements for which the test taker must indicate whether they are personally applicable. The MMPI-2 is the most widely used, and it has been translated into more than 100 languages. The current version of the MMPI-2 is a self-report personality test. The scale measures 567 items and provides information on a variety of personality characteristics. It also includes a variety of items meant to assess whether the respondent is lying or trying to make a good impression. It's not only used by clinical psychologists to assess mental health, it's also a tool for hiring decisions, and in forensic settings, it's used for assessing criminal risk. In addition to personality inventories, psychologists use projective tests, which contain a series of ambiguous stimuli, such as ink blots, to which the test taker must respond about perceptions of the stimuli. Now, the idea is to project their own meaning onto the stimulus. This method assumes that the ambiguity of the stimulus allows individuals to interpret it based on their feelings, desires, and needs. The tests are specifically designed to elicit the individual's unconscious feelings and conflicts, providing an assessment that goes deeper than the surface of personality. And we'll take a look at some sample tests, the Rorschach inkblot test and the Thematic Apperception test. A famous projective test is the Rorschach inkblot test. The test consists of 10 cards, half in black and white and half in color, which the individual views one at a time. The test taker is asked to describe what he or she sees in each of the ink blots. These responses are scored based on indications of various underlying psychological characteristics. Now, a new Rorschach scoring system has been published. From a scientific perspective, researchers are still skeptical about the Rorschach. They have criticized the test's reliability and validity. Another projective test is the Thematic Apperception test, which consists of a series of cards with black and white pictures of ambiguous settings designed to elicit stories that reveal something about an individual's personality. It requires the test taker to make up a story for each card seen. What happened before? What is happening now? What the people are feeling and thinking, and how things will turn out. Now, therapists who use this and other projective personality tests tend to be psychoanalysts who believe projections are meaningful. Therefore, the test's subjective nature is not problematic for them. And the therapist looks for recurring themes in the responses. Scoring is yet to be demonstrated to be reliable or valid. Here are examples of two of the cards from the Thematic Apperception test. Now, while there are scoring systems available, many clinicians interpret the TAT on an impressionistic basis, meaning that they inspect the content of the examinee's stories and analyze them using clinical intuition alone.